All right. At this time, I'll call our meeting to order. This is a meeting in reference to the sign ordinance, and we appreciate everyone's attendance this evening. I would ask at this time for everyone to please stand for an invocation followed by our Pledge of Allegiance. And I'd like to ask if our chaplain, Grilly Mitchell, would lead us in our invocation.
Way up there. Let us bow our head in prayer. Oh, gracious and merciful Heavenly Father, we ask you to be with this governing body as they discuss the town business. Let them be in unison, let their decisions be sound, and grant them the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding to make decisions that is beneficial to the whole entire town. We ask you to lead them and guide them in the sound direction. We ask you, Heavenly Father, for all your blessings. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
You may be seated. At this time, do I have a motion to approve the business of our agenda?
So approved.
Have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by raising your right hand. Seeing none opposed, at this time we'll discuss and take possible action on the amendments to the sign ordinance, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. McLaughlin to proceed with giving us our instructions.
All right. And I'm pretty sure we're all aware of why we're here today. Just as a background, the current ordinance was adopted on April 15th, and there were some key amendments that we addressed at that time: ground signs, billboards, elimination of pole signs, civil penalties, and a 5-year compliance period. Since that time, we experienced, we've gotten some negative feedback with freestanding pole signs not being allowed, and then with the latest recent campaign cycle, there were some issues that were raised with respect to the right-of-way and things of that nature. So the two main areas that we're going to discuss tonight would be the political temporary sign section of the ordinance and the issue of whether or not we add pole signs back or keep them currently prohibited. And that's basically what I was just saying: sign removal on private property, the length enforced of the right-of-way with the political signs, and negative trends with pole signs. Now, with respect to pole signs, we've had several conversations about this: variances, special use permits. So I've really dug deeper into our code. And with respect to variances, there are some issues. Typically, the spirit of a variance is to grant relief from the enforcement of a regulation. So if you have setback regulations that are negatively impacting your ability to develop a property, or if you have sidewalk regulations, you can ask for a variance from those regulations being enforced. With a sign, a sign is not a regulation. So it would almost be virtually impossible to write language to allow for a variance for an actual sign. Second would be possibly exploring it as a special use permit. If you look at our code, the fact that billboards are allowable by special use permit only, it would lend itself to thinking that you could possibly just do that with an actual freestanding sign as well. The only issue with that is that a billboard in itself is defined as a principal use, which is it's an off-site sign, but it's considered a principal use, which is why you see sometimes a billboard on a private piece of property, and that's the only use on that property. As such, a freestanding sign is an accessory use to a principal structure, which is a business on that property. So being that a freestanding sign is not an actual use, we actually couldn't explore language to allow it by special use, because special uses are things like daycare centers and things of that nature. So with that being said, the only real options that we have for you guys with respect to pole signs would be option A, keep them prohibited in our current ordinance, or option B would be to simply make a decision to add them back as a permitted use. If you decide to add them back as a permitted use, you could simply just instruct me to add back the exact language that was there before, which is your 30-foot height and the square footages. If that was the case, I would suggest you keep the language for ground signs in, so that you would have regulations that govern ground signs. So if a business wanted to pursue that type of sign, but you would also have regulations for pole signs. You could also add pole signs back and regulate them a little bit more by reducing the height a little bit. Before we got to the 30-foot current height in our current ordinance, it was previously unlimited. I've never personally seen one higher than 35 feet, but when we lowered it to 30 feet, it wasn't like I got a whole lot of negative feedback. So if you guys wanted to explore putting them back, you could reduce the height a little bit, but those options are yours. So in conclusion with pole signs, right now based on, and I talked at length with the counties with this as well, the only options you have is either add them back with some either existing previous language, regulate them a little bit more, or keep them out of the ordinance.
Yes, sir.
I got a question.
Okay.
I got a couple of questions. Dealing with the pole signs. Out at 95 at the interchange. I mean, without pole signs, that if we have businesses that want to come in and that interchange out there, they're going to want a pole sign, and those signs are over 30 feet in height. If we don't allow that, I mean, that could be a deterrent to business coming into the town. Another question I had as far as pole signs is, and I understand the reasoning behind the ground mounted signs. I think they look good, and I've seen them at other cities, and they look real good, but some businesses, and I rode around town looking, some businesses need a pole sign to be recognized. So I deal with codes every day. I'm an inspector. That's my full-time job. So I deal with code books, and every code has exceptions to the code. So is this something that we could allow pole signs and just have exceptions to, or like, you must have a ground-mounted sign with exceptions. So if you meet those exceptions or one of those exceptions to that, then you can be considered for a pole sign. You see what I'm saying? So like put some rules to it where, yes, you got to put a ground mounted sign unless you meet one of the following exceptions. And you know, we could come up, you could bring us back some exceptions, like I don't know if I can say the business name or not, but the pet place down here that just opened up that wants a pole sign. Well, they're in a hole. Yeah, they got writing on the business, but if you're driving like you're supposed to, and you're paying attention to traffic, and you're not looking off, you know, you may not know that business is there if there's not a sign out there to catch your attention. There's no room out there to put a ground-mounted sign. So that's something I had a question about. You know, and I understand both arguments, but I think we do need pole signs. So
I think what you're talking about, basically, there's two different ways. You could add pole signs back and regulate them heavily, but what you're talking about ties to a scenario that exists that's unique to a piece of property. And we're trying to draft language to address that in general. I think my concern is that you're all teetering towards compromising the variance process. The Board of Adjustment grants variances, and some of the criteria for variance is negatively topography negatively impacting the property, or something unique to a piece of property.
that's what I'm saying. Like,
But this is what I'm.
kind of same thing as an exception.
That's my point. So technically, when we're talking, what you're describing is what you would typically grant a variance for, because I'm trying to build on a piece of property, but based on the enforcement of the setback regulations, it makes it difficult for me to do that. That is typically when you're granting some relief from a regulation being enforced. It's difficult to do that because a sign is not a regulation. So what I would say that's what I explore with the special use permit or the variance, and based on the intent of the code, it's just not legal to write it in a way where you're granting a variance for a sign. I think you could possibly explore some language that says maybe in the ground section side, if there are, I'm not sure, because the minute I start drafting that language, I'm drafting out the first criterion for a variance. And that's why I think we should be very careful.
And one question I have is, if it were put back in the way it was, and then, which is 30-foot sign, and then we had a situation like out at exit 41, where they needed a sign higher than that.
That's what your variance
That
would
would
be
be
for.
where you could get a
That's a
variance.
great
Okay.
point. If there's a sign regulation that stated the sign height is capped at 30 feet, and there was a unique situation where someone wanted relief from the enforcement of the 30-foot height to go up to 50 feet, that's where your variance would come in.
Okay.
But to actually create a situation where we're drafting language that would require a variance for the sign to be placed there, that's where it gets very tricky, because, like I said, you're writing out the enforcement of the Board of Adjustment.
The only other statement I would have, I guess, is I'm for having pole signs. If we regulate them heavily, that's fine. But I think there needs to be an option for pole signs. And another reason too is we have a Class 2 ISO rate, and our fire department is a Class 2. That's the lowest in Cumberland County besides Fayetteville. Okay. And everybody knows with that rating, anything below a 6 doesn't help the homeowner anymore. Anything 6 and below, that's the best insurance premium that a homeowner can get in a minimum. Anything below a 6 attracts businesses and companies to come in. That's where we get our tax dollars from. And I don't want to do away with pole signs and do away with pole signs altogether and deter a company or a business from coming in town and investing in our town because we don't want pole signs. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We worked hard I say we, but the town, the fire department worked hard. There's a lot of paperwork, a lot of time, a lot of money involved in achieving that rating. And for us not to use that rating to attract these companies and businesses, I just think we need them. So I'm for pole signs. I'm for regulating. That would be you doing the language, I guess, and bringing us something back. But however we need to do that.
Okay.
Do you have, somewhere in this paperwork, do we have written what the former language was for the ordinance?
No, but just right off the top of my head, the main changes to it was the height and the square footage. The way the square footage is set up, is the square footage is derived by the zoning classification. So you have C1 and C1P square footage requirements. You have industrial and things of that nature. But the height was 30 feet, and the average square footage was about 100 square feet. So that language coming back would simply be primarily summarized as height and square footage in terms of the change that you would be going back to. And it wouldn't be new language. It would just be the previous language being added back.
Okay, so I guess next, someone else have,
I have a question.
yes, Commissioner Edwards?
Before we had mentioned something about that if there was, a pole sign was destroyed or damaged or anything, that it would no longer be grandfathered in. Now this, if we go back to the original verbiage and all, that would not apply, right?
No, I mean, but because basically if you reinstated the same language, it removes the existing pole signs from being grandfathered in. So the only reason why they were grandfathered is because we took it away from being a permitted use. If you're actually making it a permitted use again, and then one is destroyed, they would just simply be coming back in to get another sign.
If DOT was to come in and say, well, we're going to widen this road, so this pole sign is going to have to be moved, all they can do is it's already been approved, so the business owner just has to relocate it.
Yes. Now, a lot of times we do work with a business owner. If it's something that's no fault of their own and it's tied to a right-of-way acquisition, things of nature, we still require that they come in and get the permit, but I may waive the fees because it wasn't a fault of their own. But that's things we can work out. It would be tricky if that happened during a time where they aren't allowed. It would lend itself to a legal interpretation where I would probably try to find some kind of way to allow that to fall under the grandfather clause, but it'd be kind of tricky to do that. But that's and to answer your question, if you added the language back, it would eliminate that issue with the existing pole signs.
Mayor?
Yes, sir, Commissioner Webb?
Madam Attorney, do you see any problems with the discussion the way it's going? As far as the wording of a pole sign or the replacement of a pole sign if it gets damaged?
I don't think we're at the point yet where I understand exactly what the board wants to do, so I don't know that I want to advise on the legal implications of any language until we've got some, right in front of us. I don't see any problems with what Chancellor has explained is, why we can't do a special use, why we can't do a variance, that all makes sense. And I think that the explanation of grandfathered status, if you don't need it anymore, then we're not taking anything away from people if they're no longer grandfathered. It just simply, there's no regulation that would apply where they would need that status.
Now, I understand what Mr. Marley's saying about keeping businesses away because they can't have a pole sign. I do think the monument signs are much more attractive. But I do understand in a situation like with the pet store down here where they may have to have a pole sign, and there should be a way they can apply for that. Although they got signs all over the building now, you can see them from miles away. But I'm kind of confused on that a little bit. I really like the monument signs because of the appearance of them. And there's not too many places in Hope Mills that could not have a monument sign.
And I do think, just to piggyback on what Commissioner Legg stated, I do think that just from me reading the tea leaves, some of the reasons why I don't think we received any permits requesting the decorative ground signs, we never had regulations in our ordinance to identify them or regulate them. Now we actually have regulations that dictate, it has to be professional, decorative, things of that nature with height and square footage requirements. So if you add the pole signs back and keep ground signs in, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to want a pole sign. I'm honestly thinking that when you have this ground sign language in there, it does attract people to possibly trying to explore doing that type of sign. But maybe it wasn't explored because it just wasn't listed as used. We just called them freestanding signs. Now you'll have a section, possibly if you move in that direction, a ground sign with regulations in a C1P and regulations that govern a pole sign. Strict stipulation that you can't have both. But if you wanted to do a pole sign, this would be the height and square footage. If you want to do a ground sign, these would be the scenarios that you would apply for. But each business is allowed a wall sign and a freestanding sign. Under this scenario, they would do your wall sign, but they would have the option of doing a ground sign or a pole sign.
Any other
Madam
Commissioner?
Mayor,
Yes,
I got a
Commissioner
couple
Bell.
questions, so I got one and then a follow-up. So if I understand this correctly, we will not be able to use a special permit to allow pole signs to come back in.
That's correct.
Okay. The reservation I have is that if we put pole signs back in and businesses have an option, they'll go to the pole signs. That's conjecture on my part, perhaps, but I think that's why we took them out to begin with. So, if we were to put them back in, describe to me what heavily regulated would look like.
More heavily regulated than the previous language would simply be you could lower the height from 30 feet to 20 feet. You could lower the square footage from 100 square feet to 75 square feet. So what that means is you're allowing them in, but a little bit more heavily regulated. But back to the initial question, if you recall, when we had our work sessions before, we were asking what was the issue we were trying to address with eliminating pole signs. We were never given any direction on that, so I don't really know of any way to heavily regulate it outside of something that you would tell me that would be an issue you wanted us to address. If you recall our previous work session, the issues that staff were presented with respect to the sign ordinance was your temporary signs, like your mattress signs. They were putting them. We pick up 100. We did a sign sweep Friday. I picked up 157 signs in 2 hours. But they were getting creative. They were bolting them to light posts 15 feet in the air and things of that nature. We just personally, from a staff level, we were never experiencing any negative aspects of pole signs, but they were prohibited and taken out because we were instructed to do so. So if you're talking about coming back in and regulating them more heavily, the only thing I can think of right now with devoid of an issue that I would need to address would be reducing the height and the square footage, but just not so much so that it eliminates the effectiveness of even having one.
Just one to tack onto that is, from what I see, and I guess the others that have ridden around see, is the pole signs typically are chains and are professionally done, very expensive.
You're not going to typically see a small mom and pop with a 30-foot pole
'cause
sign.
Their pole
Yeah.
signs are too expensive for
Yeah.
somebody just to throw
That's
a pole
correct.
sign up. That's why I believe even if you look over there, you're going to see they're professionally done. It's not a sign that somebody can just, and the pole itself is probably, a couple $1,000s and maybe more than that. So you know the expense is there. That's what I'm looking at is, I don't know. I know we don't want a lot of, I guess, distractions or whatever, but they are professionally done. It's not a case of those particular signs not being professionally done.
And even from an engineering standpoint, another thing that may drive up the cost is once you get to a certain height, it has to be engineered with plans to make sure that it complies with wind loads and things of that nature. So that's an extra cost. But Mayor Warner is correct. I don't see your small mom and pop beauty salon coming in to do a 30-foot pole sign.
You had another item you wanted to speak to?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So, when we talk about heavily regulating pole signs, and we have an ordinance now about monument signs. So, we could leave the monument signs in, and if the property would not be sufficient enough for a monument sign, then a pole sign could be used. Is that language the right way to go, or is it?
The minute I start talking about unique characteristics of a piece of property, that's where I'm going towards a variance.
Yeah.
That's the first criterion for a variance. So that's why I said I wouldn't advise you guys to move in that direction. I think the best option, if you're going to go that route, is you allow for either or. But we have language that would not allow a pole sign and a actual ground sign. So you could only do one of those. But there are specific regulations for setbacks, square footage, and height for the ground sign, setback, square footage, and height for the actual pole sign. And they're done on a tiered approach. So the higher the pole sign, the further the setback. So everybody's not going to automatically come in and do a 30-foot tall sign. Somebody may come in and do a 15-foot tall sign. But our ordinance is written where 0 to 10 feet is a certain setback, 10 to 20 feet is a certain setback. So that's what we currently have in place. But I do think that if you're going to go that route, having both as options would probably be more prudent.
Okay, thank you, Mayor.
Mayor Pro Tem, you're the only one that has a comment. Do you have a comment?
No, I just wanted to know, was there a problem in the first place?
No, not specifically tied to pole signs. Some of the other things we put in place with the previous ordinance, we required that the sign be done by a professional company. It'll surprise you some of the stuff we see, but it's directly related to pole signs. That was more of a desire of the board. It wasn't something that we looked at as an issue And that's why you probably don't see a whole lot of specific regulations tied to pole signs outside of just not allowing them. Now, if you don't have any more issues on pole signs, I would like to go to the political.
Okay. Do you want to act on this, or?
Let me go ahead and go
You'll
through the
just
whole
do the
thing
whole
and then
thing at
just
one
get
time?
yeah.
Okay.
All right, now with respect to political campaign signs, I think we're all aware of what happened with this area. The goal here was to streamline the language in the ordinance. Dan, from the very beginning, had always said we need to be careful regulating content. We need to be careful regulating content. So what he ultimately did, what I was leaning towards, is just complying with the general statute in general, meaning that if you recall the right-of-way issue, our current ordinance has 15 feet from the edge of pavement. Most of the contention with the community was tied to them feeling we were coming on their property. 15 feet is pretty heavy-handed. The general statute says 3 feet. So when I started complying with the general statute, especially when the one-stop voting and things of that nature, Mr. Hartsoff still said, even though it's the general statute, it could lend itself to a legal challenge. And I'm saying, wait a minute, there's a political campaign sign section in every ordinance in the country. I mean, the 10 that I have memorized off the top of my head between us and Greensboro, Fayetteville, Pinehurst, Aberdeen, there is a political campaign section. That still does not mean that it couldn't lend itself to a challenge. Just because it hadn't been challenged doesn't mean that it can't be. So what Dan and I came up with is a language that would completely change this section from temporary political signs to temporary non-commercial signs. What we basically said is, if we keep the language to temporary across the board, then we're applying these regulations to all temporary signs. It's when we actually specifically say political campaign signs can't be more than 32 square feet, or political campaign signs can't be within certain feet of the right of way. We're specifically regulating that type of sign. So what the language is that I'm going to read to you is our way of streamlining it so that it reads temporary non-commercial sign, but the intent of it and how it's regulated is the same as how we used to regulate political campaign signs. I feel this approach, like I said, removes us from legal challenges. It still allows for, I think, the intent of what you guys would like to see done. But this section is 102A 1404H, and again, the title would now be temporary non-commercial signs. It would, and section H would say temporary non-commercial signs may be permitted in any district on private property subject to the following conditions. That's directly out of the general statute, but again, the title is temporary non-commercial signs. No temporary non-commercial sign H1 shall exceed 32 square feet. We didn't change the square footage. We just changed the language to say temporary non-commercial versus temporary political sign. H2, nothing in this provision shall be construed to authorize the posting of temporary signs upon trees, utility poles, traffic control, or street names, signposts, etc., etc., etc. H3, temporary non-commercial signs shall not be erected on town property or other public property except as authorized by subsection 4. Again, this just changed the temporary political wording to say temporary non-commercial. So everywhere you see temporary non-commercial, the current language says temporary political. So by us changing it to temporary non-commercial, then that basically keeps it, like I said, streamlined to this could apply to any temporary sign. Subsection 4 reads temporary non-commercial signs. This is the part that ties to election day. They can be erected on election day at officially designated polling places other than those polling places designated as one-stop voting. Polling places are permitted no sooner than 5 p.m. on the day before the election, provided the signs are located in accordance with regulations of the Board of Elections and must be removed within 24 hours of the close of the election. Signs at designated polling places are permitted to be erected no sooner than 5 p.m. on the day before. For the one-stop voting polling places, temporary non-commercial signs are permitted during the entire voting period and shall be removed within 24 hours. Now, this last section, I think if you recall, our current ordinance states 30 days prior to the actual municipal election. But during this challenge, Dan raised some issues because some people felt that your early voting period starts well in advance of that. If just because I'm not voting in Hope Mills does not mean I'm not casting a vote in a Hope Mills election. So that's why I think he put the section in it that says they're permitted during the entire voting period. Last section, this applies to the general statute as well. All temporary non-commercial signs shall be located no closer than 3 feet from the edge of pavement. So most of the intent of the language didn't change at all. The main gist of what we did is we reduced the edge of pavement in the right of way from 15 to 3, and we just streamlined the language by replacing everywhere that said temporary political sign with temporary non-commercial sign. I do agree with, I was a little nervous at first, but when we actually combed through it and read it this way, we're not losing the intent of your ability to campaign in any way, but we're removing ourselves from any legal challenge. Now, what people have to realize is there is going to be someone that's going to have a sign that's 2 feet from the edge of the curb, and we're going to pick it up, and they're going to start complaining. But if that rises to the level of a challenge, we should be a little bit more covered. I thought we should be covered by just mirroring the general statute, but Attorney Hartsoff felt that we can go up a little bit, a step higher than that, and that's what you have here.
Anyone have a question or discussion?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir, Commissioner Legg?
We're talking about signs can't be more than 8 feet high or more than
32 square feet.
32 square feet. That's a 4x8.
That's the current language the way it is now.
We had a candidate this year that rented a big sign.
That's correct.
Is that legal?
In my interpretation, that is not. If you recall, a notice of violation was sent to that candidate. There were 2 violations. It was the duration of time it was out was in violation of the 30-day rule, and the fact that, in my opinion, a billboard that has a political advertisement is considered a campaign sign, so the size of it exceeded the 32 square feet. The problem was that we didn't have a mechanism to force the removal. The only thing I could do with my authority that I currently have is to send out a notice of violation letter, which is what we did.
Okay. My other question had to do with if it's on poles, is it considered a pole sign, or does the temporary campaign sign override all that?
I think the temporary, we technically not call them temporary campaign signs anymore, but I would basically say the regulations that tie to the height of the temporary sign and the square footage of the temporary sign, if it's on a pole or not. I don't think we have regulations that make that distinction. So if it's on a pole, but it's lower than 8 feet and it's smaller than 32 square feet and it's still a temporary mobile sign, I do think that still fits the intent of what the definition of a temporary sign is.
But it would be called a temporary non-commercial sign in the new ordinance, correct?
That's correct.
I believe that's all I have for now, Mayor. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Madam Mayor, the only comment I have, Chancellor, is where does this language address billboards?
It doesn't. If you're talking about the billboard advertisement, that's a tricky one, to be honest with you, because even if we put this in here, that we can't put in there that you can't put a political advertisement on the billboard, because that's back to regulating content. So that's a very tricky one. And even if it's in violation, I don't know what mechanism we have to remove it, because I can't put a lien on it that's something we'd have to address. We didn't actually go in that avenue in terms of a violation with that specific issue. But I do not think we can legally say in this ordinance you can't put a political campaign on a billboard, because
How can it be in violation?
to me, you mean having a billboard?
How can a political sign on a billboard be in violation of this amendment if the language is not there?
Because to me, the language doesn't have to be in there about billboards for that sign to be considered to be political in nature as a sign. So to me, a billboard is listed in our ordinance as a type of sign. So to me, that ad on that billboard constitutes a political campaign sign, and that's what puts it in the violation of the ordinance. I'm saying if you want us to address that and for a future day, it would be a little bit difficult, because I can't rise to the level of saying you can't have a political ad on a billboard. Only thing I can really say is your square footage requirement is 32 and your height requirement is 8. I would actually probably have to draft some strong enforcement language, as opposed to trying to say billboards are not allowed to be, you can't advertise on a billboard.
So I come back, I'm going to circle back to my original question. How can a candidate be in violation if the language is not here to support that violation?
The language you currently have that specifically ties to that violation is the square footage and the height.
Yeah, but it doesn't address billboards.
If I look at
That word is not there.
the word billboard is defined in our ordinance as a type of sign. The minute you put a campaign ad on that billboard, my legal interpretation of that is that makes it a campaign sign in nature, which means that it's in violation of the regulations that we currently have that we're calling temporary non-commercial signs. But that would be, it's the definition of the type of sign that puts it in violation of this section. I don't think you have to have billboards listed in this section for that to be a violation.
Man, I would ask Katie for an opinion.
So I would support Chancellor's interpretation that your sign ordinance generally, as a whole, treats billboards as signs. So I would never go to a Superior Court judge and try to tell him about how a billboard isn't a sign as a starting point. I think that having had the particular type of content in your sign ordinance saying, this is how we treat political campaign signs, the violation was sort of very clear before. In this language, it might be a little less clear, but the intent of something being temporary is what we're going for. Just to support what Chancellor said earlier in the presentation, since 2015, the United States Supreme Court has said that municipalities cannot regulate content or speech based on content. So that's why we're talking about taking the political campaign sign language out of your sign ordinance, because if you're saying this type of speech, this is what your sign can look like, you're regulating speech based on content. And so the billboard question, I know that your sign ordinance has sort of a permit structure for billboards that are permanent, right? So like if you want to have a billboard up permanently, there's a mechanism for getting that type of billboard approved. There's a different type of permit, I believe, for temporary.
Temporary signs or signs that are allowed without a permit.
Right. And so we're treating billboards as signs, and then temporary signs all would be regulated under this section. As far as the enforcement mechanism, that's something we'd have to sit down and talk about.
That would be a
but
tricky one.
Sitting here now, I think the only thing that we could do is litigate, and when you're talking about something that's temporary in nature, that's a very awkward and clumsy tool to try to enforce something. Yeah, I think billboards, we can workshop that some more, but that might continue to be a problem.
Thank you, Katie. It was just a point of clarity.
Yeah, no, I understand.
That's all this.
Okay. Any other questions? Or
I
Yes,
would
ma'am.
like to say I'm in support of changing this. My political signs were pulled as what I consider off of private property, and the previous board asked for the ordinance to be enforced for my signs. So then you all had to enforce it for everyone's signs. And I think it took up a lot of the staff's time riding around pulling up signs with the language that was on the previous ordinance. There's always an election season going on, not just our election. There's another election going on now. So I support this one, and I could have legally challenged you all and sued you all and probably won for my signs being pulled off of private property, but I chose not to.
Yeah.
So I support this.
And even with these changes, somebody's going to raise an issue. Even with this, there's no language we can draft that is foolproof. So even if we're moving in this direction, which I think is a positive step, even if I pull up a sign that's 2 feet from the street, somebody's going to raise an issue. So at some point, we have to pretty much draft this stuff and kind of stick with it. But I do think, especially on what Commissioner McCray, Mayor Pro Tem McCray indicated, had we simply followed the intent of the ordinance to its letter of the law, that could have lent itself to a legal interpretation or a challenge. This reduces that ability or that occurrence from happening.
So at this point, do you need a motion?
I need, going back to pole signs, I need a motion on which direction you want with the pole signs and a motion on moving forward with the current language you see.
So what I was hearing
the
with pole
temporary.
sign is to add them back as a permitted use based on what was previously there.
As an option, that's
As
correct.
an option, or an option would be to,
Lower the height or the square footage.
Square footage.
And then option 3 is just
or
leave it
leave
the way it is.
Or leave it as is.
so if you leave it as is, it would be 30 feet is the height, right? And the square footage, I can't recall what you said the square footage was.
I think the square footage is 100, but I think that's, and don't quote me specifically on that, but basically the language that allows the square footage based on the zoning classification, we would just go back to that
And as
language.
far as the pole signs previously with that previous language, we did not have any problems with that particular ordinance as far as the signage, because I know it was changed from a higher height down to that when we went through the sign ordinance back in
17, I think.
2017.
What we
I know
did in
we'd
2017,
adjusted
yeah.
pole signs so that they were more at a level that we thought was more pleasing to the eye.
Yeah.
With the thought at that time that if we did have someone at exit 41 or 95 or 295 or wherever that needed to have a higher sign, that business would have to come in and request,
I think the point you raised today with that, I think that is probably the most eye-opening to me with respect to all the development we see coming off in that area along South Main, I-95 and things of that nature. The way the current language is, I'm just stuck telling them they have to put in ground signs. But if there is an area along there that needs to go higher than 30 feet, you're preserving the ability, if you add it back, you're preserving the ability for them to request to go higher. But that decision rests with the Board of Adjustment, so it's not like I can just administratively and arbitrarily approve a 50-foot tall pole sign. But I do think in terms of our future development of Hope Mills, with that being the area that development is going in, I do think that's a very good point to make.
okay, so discussion or motion or? Okay, what's your motion, ma'am? Do you know what your motion is?
I'd like to make a motion to have the pole sign verbiage put back in the way it was originally. Is that not good enough?
Do you want to make the temporary sign within that motion, or you'll make two separate motions?
That's
Okay.
your pleasure.
Then I'd also like to make a motion to approve the new amendments of the political campaign signs.
So we have a motion to add back the verbiage from the previous ordinance on pole signs and to add the amendments to temporary sign ordinance?
That's correct.
Okay, so I have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Any more discussion in reference to these two items?
Mayor,
Yes, sir.
can I have that read again?
Okay,
Could you
the,
read it to me again?
pole signs would be added back as a permitted use with the language from the
Previous
ordinance,
yeah.
which is 30 feet high and 100 square feet. And then the temporary, non-commercial signs would be the amendments that are before you, which I don't want to read all those, but it would be all of this that would make the change.
I understand.
Okay? So I have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by raising your right hand. Any opposed? So it's a 3-2.
And just for clarification, that new language you're talking about, I'll bring it back to the board at the next board meeting. And the official motion at that point would be to approve me to move it forward to the planning board. But that would give you guys a chance to see the actual language in its entirety. And what I typically do is give it to you in the ordinance with track changes on it, so you can see the language that's actually being changed.
Okay.
And if you want, I usually do another fact sheet that lists each page and explains what those sections are. But that's similar to what we're doing here. So, but the main point is at the next board meeting, I want to bring something back so you guys can look at it first, and then we'll instruct it to send it to the county. It goes to planning board, and then it comes back to you guys for full adoption.
And
Did
with
we
that-
act on this too soon then, if he's gonna bring it back?
No, it has to go this route.
Yeah, the
It's
route
got to
you're
go-
basically taking now is to instruct me to, you're approving the language that
Okay, that you get.
that I'm doing now. I could just go to the county, but I usually wanted to let you guys look at it.
But as far as it returning to the county, do we know how long that process will take?
I typically say anything that requires planning board approval, you can pretty much chalk up about 2 months. Because even if I send it to them today, it's probably going to be February planning board coming back to you guys in March, simply because with the way those dates coincide with it being a public hearing, you have to do the advertisement. I can see if I can fast track it through the county, but it would definitely, I would say, at least a 2-month process. Before it comes back to you guys and before it's fully adopted, where now these are permitted uses back in our ordinance again.
Madam Mayor, I have
Yes,
a
sir.
question.
Okay.
What if we have a business come in, apply for a sign tomorrow?
Any sign that's applied for before full adoption is under the current rules. So
You're
if someone
saying the
came in,
current rules is,
No pole signs.
yeah,
Well, just-
there are still no pole signs until it comes back to you guys for full adoption. That's ultimately when I have the authority to approve it under the new ordinance. If you recall, and I don't want anybody to be alarmed, but when Chick-fil-A comes, they're going to have a 30-foot pole sign because they tracked the work sessions that we had last year, and they submitted the 30-foot tall pylon sign application about 2 days before full adoption. So anything that comes to my desk prior to now, and when it comes back to you guys for approval, we're still under the current one that does not allow for pole signs.
Is there, I know that our next board meeting is not until January the 30th. So is there some means that we could get this to the planning board before? Right, so no action could be taken then. So that's my question. Is there some,
February meeting.
which would put it,
This is my ultimate question. In order to send language to the county, does that require board action or just direction from the board through the town manager? Meaning, is it possible for me to get them the language and them to just instruct me to move it forward? I think you guys already made the motion to adopt or approve the direction that I'm going in, but my ultimate question is just to send it to the county to start the process of sending it to the planning board. Does that require board approval?
I think with the motion that was made earlier, I think you would be free to send it to the county. The language that was proposed has been adopted per that motion.
And under that scenario, I can pretty much have this language done probably within the next couple of days.
Okay.
Just to go ahead and get it in. simply because if I'm not under those constraints, me not literally waiting a month just to be told, take this to the county, I would still send it through you guys for you guys to look at, and then if you're okay with the language, then I'll move it to the county with those instructions. But I can get that to you a lot quicker now, if that's the
The
direction
reason
you
why I
want.
say that is I know there's some concerns that we've already been made aware of. So that if you prolong it till February, which would put March or April,
Then, yeah.
that might create some issues with those that are trying to,
What I'll do is I'll talk to the county to see what their current deadlines are in terms of dates for the next planning board,
I
and
think it's the 15th, if we get something to them.
by the
before
15th.
15th.
That's the rate. So I'll contact the county tomorrow, get the dates, and then when I send you the language, it'll have the scenarios and the dates and things of that nature, so we can at least eye in when it'll be coming back to you guys.
okay. Okay.
All right.
All righty. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, that concludes our purpose for this meeting. We will have, do we adjourn or recess?
We're adjourning.
Adjourning. Okay, so we're going to be adjourning this meeting, so do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Have a motion, do I have a second? All those in favor, say aye. All right, and we will start back in 5 minutes, so.